this would comprise the fourth session on Adorno. He says on page 150 of Negative Dialectics, the idea of a changed philosophy would be to become aware of likeness by defining it as that which is unlike itself. Now, the interesting or operative word here is the act of defining. This is interesting, isn't it? Because the idea of a changed philosophy would be to define in a dialectical way. That's how we can properly translate this. The idea of a changed philosophy would be to define likeness as in a dialectical way. In other words, it contains its opposition, which is unlike itself. So just trying to simplify this, just trying to simplify it. If we want to have a changed philosophy, we would necessarily, if we want to move in this direction of change from the world of identity, then what we would be seeking is the act of defining things, of determining things on the basis of dialectics. That's essentially really what it comes down to, because the operative act, the activity of this change is specifically the act of defining, of determining, of laying down a concept in reality, but doing it in such a way that that concept contains opposition. It contains contradiction in it. Adorno says that emphatically conceived, the judgment that a man is free refers to the concept of freedom. But this concept, in turn, is more than is predicated of the man. And by other definitions, the man is more than the concept of his freedom. The concept says not only that it is applicable to all individuals defined as free, it feeds on the idea of a condition in which individuals would have qualities not to be ascribed to anyone here and now. Emphatically conceived, the determination that a man is free, that an individual is free, we are utilizing a concept in the act or the process. The activity of this judgment is informed, is motivated, is moved by a concept of freedom. We are saying that this man corresponds to a concept of freedom. And the understanding of this is why the concept of freedom, the way we define it, the way we determine it, if determining it with the use of a dialectical logic, is incredibly important, because you note that the judgment we are making of freedom, when we lay down the pronouncement of something being free, that conclusion is the result of a concept that we have conceived of freedom. So if the concept itself is impoverished, if the concept itself is lacking, then when we make the judgment of freedom and say that a man is free, it is possible indeed to say that a man is free based upon our concept of freedom, but the concept is so impoverished that it doesn't actually mean that the man is free. We're saying he's free, but our concept is so impoverished that we are actually defining freedom in a way that an individual is still left in servitude or bondage because we control the concept in this sense. So there's a danger here. There's just a danger of a society that constructs an impoverished notion of freedom and then seeks to impose that or use that as a loaded concept of freedom, so that essentially freedom is never achieved. And this is the reason why negative thought is so important, because it is constantly pushing against our conceptual structures and breaking them down. It's deconstructing them. Or if it's dialectical, it is examining the internal architecture of the concept. So it is ultimately finding the contradiction that emerges from within the concept to explode the concept, to transcend and be able to progress past the concept, to expand the concept so that our comprehension of freedom is expanded into something that is more substantive. And freedom, it really is the most important concept in philosophy. It's probably the most important concept in the world. Now, it's possible that's not true, but the entire point, for example, of dialectics is freedom. That's the whole point of it, is rooted in moving in the direction of freedom. The whole point of Hegel's philosophy can be summarized in freedom. He was striving and pushing in the direction of freedom. And so this concept of freedom, it matters greatly how we defined it, because we're using it essentially as the supreme ideal. And if we're using it as the supreme ideal and it's impoverished, or it contains attributes or determinations of tyranny, unfreedom is locked within it in a way that we don't understand that unfreedom, so we end up being pushed into the bondage of that unfreedom, because this concept is pushed as a totality in society, as a totality, so that there's no way to get beyond it. And because it contains unfreedom, I know this is very abstract, because it contains unfreedom, it is in fact, it's an idealism of freedom. But this idealism of freedom itself contains bondage within it. So when we use it in society as the supreme ideal, and we have an impoverished identity version of freedom that does not have a dialectic comprehension to it, it just means that it's going to place humans in bondage in the name of freedom. That's what's going to happen. The name of freedom will be there, but the concrete reality will still contain a concrete unfreedom. So Adorno says, emphatically conceived, the judgment that a man is free refers to the concept of freedom. But this concept in turn is more than is predicated of the man. So we're not obtaining the totality of freedom merely through looking at the notion of man or the notion of freedom. They're bound up in each other. And by other definitions, the man is more than the concept of his freedom. So this is very important. There is a phenomenological reality, a material reality here that transcends the concept. So there's always a danger of the concept becoming a tyranny if it does not continue to evolve and comport with the actual material object, the movement and development of the material object itself. It has to have a synthesis with the reality of evolution as it progresses through time. It has to be able to adapt and expand with the concrete nature of the material object. The concept says not only that it is applicable to all individuals defined as free, it feeds on the idea of a condition in which individuals would have qualities not to be ascribed to anyone here and now. So, essentially, freedom has this, it's like a transcendent notion or concept, something that we're always striving and moving toward. So the idea is that we've not completely fulfilled it. Let's keep reaching toward it. That's how I interpret this. I see that Adorno has this contained within this thought. It feeds on the idea of a condition in which individuals would have qualities not to be ascribed to anyone here and now. So this progression, this moving forward, and the notion of these concrete material qualities. The specific of praising a man as free, he says, let's see here, is ascribed to him because it shows in him. This quality, striking and secret at the same time, animates every identifying judgment that is worth making. So, this quality, striking and secret at the same time, that's interesting language he has there, a secretness to the notion of freedom, that's mysterious, animates every identifying judgment that is worth making, because once again, the notion of freedom is such a high ideal. So every single judgment, every single concept, you can essentially infuse it with freedom, or you say that it's moving toward freedom, that it has this desire, this march toward freedom. Adorno says on page 151, the potential of freedom calls for criticizing what an inevitable formalization has made of the potential. So, the potential of freedom calls for criticism. Isn't that interesting? The potential of freedom, what freedom could be, it calls for criticism. It's very important that this attribute is attached to the notion of freedom to strengthen the concept, to discover the unfreedom within the concept of freedom. That's dialectical thinking, so that it can become aware of that concept, so that it can expand into a stronger, richer, concrete formation of freedom. On page 153, Adorno says, it is up to dialectical cognition to pursue the inadequacy of thought and thing, to experience it in the thing. It is up to dialectical cognition, this awareness, to pursue the inadequacy of thought and thing. So, it's precisely dialectic's vocation to look at thought and to criticize it and break it down, to find where the error is. That's why Gillian Rose titled her book on Adorno, The Melancholy Science. The melancholy science, because it's the pursuit of negatively breaking down conceptual structures to find the untruth or the opposition that lies within them, because that's the only path. That's the only logical path to be undeceived by the concepts that we take to have authority, that have authority over us. This is the importance of dialectic, that it engages in this kind of project of radical critique, and it's the burden of the dialectician to engage in this process. Adorno says, dialectical contradiction is not simply. It means, it has the subjective significance that it cannot be talked out of this. In this meaning, this intention, dialectics aims at what is different. It is always as philosophy's self-criticism that the dialectical motion stays philosophical. So, dialectics aims at what is different. So, dialectic is essentially born at the point, we might even say modern dialectic, or we could say the most expanded form, the most developed form of dialectic that we have, which is the dialectic that was articulated by Hegel. Now, this dialectic was essentially born in Hegel at the point where he criticized or critiqued Aristotle's logic, but specifically it's the concept of identity. Because the concept of identity is taken to be so crucial and vital to the foundation and the power and the authority of thought. And it's taken to be the supreme authority within the domain of thought. It's considered to be unconquerable. But Hegel essentially collapses it from within. So he uses identity's presuppositions against identity itself. It's probably the most genius maneuver in all of philosophical history, because it's not possible for identity to escape the criticism, because identity contains the presuppositions, the eminent architecture that undermines it. Dialectic is an eminent critique, meaning it's a critique from within. The contradiction in dialectic proceeds, it arrives from within the concept itself. The concept already contains it, and Hegel saw this. He saw it in there, and he drew it out in Aristotle. So Aristotle's identity can't do anything because it contains the presupposition of difference to make sense of itself. That's the genius of Hegel's mind. He understood that identity contained difference within itself as a concept, because it has to utilize that. It's a presupposition of identity for identity to exist. It has to make use of difference to make itself intelligible. There's no way past it, because identity, as Hegel says, is actually making the statement that it's not different from itself. If you remove this, if you take away difference, you cannot have identity. If you take away up, you cannot have down. This is the way the concept essentially works. So Adorno says that dialectical contradiction is not simply, it means it has the subjective significance that it cannot be talked out of this. And this meaning, this intention, dialectics aims at what is different. So you see, we can see dialectic here functioning in a meta position. We can see dialectic coming along as a scientific observer to the conceptual world of man. It's a logical observer. It's a logic of observation to the conceptual world. And it helps us, if we utilize it, to make sense of reality in a more profound way, because it's trying to understand reality within the nature of the internal structure of things, the internal architecture of things, as opposed to merely being deceived by the appearance of things. For certain, dialectic comprises an expansion in the development of human consciousness. For certain it does this. It is as philosophy's self-criticism that the dialectical motion stays philosophical. So dialectic is continuing to do a self-criticism of philosophy. It stays, it is itself a position of motion. It is a logic of motion. And Adorno is just, I think, trying to make a case here because he's fond of philosophy. He's a philosopher. He believes in the value of philosophy. So I believe here he's trying to make the case that dialectic is philosophical in nature, and that it is engaged in the project of its own self-criticism even. Adorno is certainly not easy to understand. So, one more quote here from page 149. Adorno says, living in the rebuke that the thing is not identical with the concept is the concept's longing to become identical with the thing. Maybe back up just a tad bit here and say that he says to define identity as the correspondence of the thing in itself to its concept is hubris. But the ideal of identity must not simply be discarded. Living in the rebuke that the thing is not identical with the concept is the concept's longing to become identical with the thing. So, this is an interesting notion. It's strange what we're about to talk about here. We're about to talk about the psychology of the conceptual world. And that's strange because Adorno says the concept's longing, as though the concept itself contains this psychological structure, this psychological motivation, we should say. This is incredibly bizarre. So it's not the concept's longing, but it's that our concepts are born from human psychology. And so they contain the human psychology of man in man's deep, intricate longing and desires. So why would the concept have a longing to become identical with the thing? That's what it's striving for. We want to be able to use the concept to understand the world completely. Now, dialectics understand, and especially negative dialectics understands, that there is that the phenomenological world, that the material world is in constant motion and is constantly changing as it develops through the course of evolution, and society is changing, and that a responsible philosophy, an intelligent philosophy, has to be able to develop, to change, to adapt, to expand with the evolution of the individual, with material reality, and with society itself. It has to be able to expand. So, even though the concept's longing to become identical with the thing, it's understandable that it has this longing, and that longing is important because that longing does give us a power over nature. We do have great success in creating concepts that have tremendous authority and power, correspondent power. And we can use these. Once we have these concepts, we can use these. And we don't use them carefully enough. We could always use them with far more intelligence because they contain the authority, they contain the power they contain the accuracy, we might say, of a correspondence. And that accuracy infuses them with a high level of functional authority that an individual cannot deny. If the individual tries to deny it, they are essentially crushed by the concept because the concept has such a strong correspondence to reality. Now, the nihilist or the skeptic is constantly attacking this concept, and they want to break it down at a highly semantical level. Now, there's only value to that if the critic does not lose sight of the object, the objection, the what his project is aiming at. His project should be aiming at a nuance that gets at an even greater precision of articulation of the nature of reality. So there's no way for us to escape the use of concepts. We would be foolish to do it because we would be reduced to an impulse structure. So it's incredible how powerful language is. And those who try to attack conceptual structures that have high levels of authority, functional authority, they try to attack them. And this is very important. I think this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to say in this session. They try to attack these conceptual structures with a form of radical skepticism because they want to undermine the authority of the conceptual structure. This is most important, though. More importantly, though, they want to smuggle in an ideology that cannot meet the burden of proof that they are demanding for the concept they are criticizing. They can't even come close to meeting this burden of proof. If you turn their criteria back against their own ideology, it would self-destruct 100-fold more than the position they are criticizing. But they never do this because the subconscious objective of these individuals is not to get at truth, is not to understand the world better. It is essentially to smuggle in their ideology. They're regressionists, and they're trying to invert the Enlightenment, essentially, so they can replace rational and empirical principles that, of course, do not meet an exact radical skeptical burden of proof. Nothing does. So that they can smuggle in regressive, superstitious principles, because these regressive, superstitious principles, they're binary in their thinking. They're black and white, and they're easier to control, and it's easier to force people into black and white categories so that you can divide them, you can demonize them, essentially, is what's happening. And a good domain to see this in is the domain of anti-psychiatry, which is a cult. In the domain of anti-psychiatry, this is precisely what's happening. You have this radical skeptical critique attacking the psychiatric position, attacking the pharmacological position, the position of pharmacology of medicine, and demanding these exact standards. But what happens, these anti-psychiatrists, they then smuggle in, they want to attack these enlightened positions who are trying to help humans and reduce human suffering, and they've done that to a high degree. They're trying to smuggle in a regressive, tyrannical ideology in place of these enlightened categories. Now, I'm not saying that psychiatry doesn't need to be criticized. That's not the point that I'm making. I'm making the point that this nihilistic criticism is essentially, it's falsely, it just makes the criticism so it can smuggle in its own ideology. It's not sincere, it's not authentic, it's not really trying to get at the truth, because if it was trying to get at the truth, it would apply this same radical skepticism to its own position. But it doesn't do that. It exempts its position from this. And this procedure, this tactic, is used essentially universally throughout the world. This is what religion does, and apologists do this exact same thing. All religious apologists attack rational, empirical positions, demanding absolute certainty, and when the positions can't provide that, they smuggle in their supernaturalism, which fails 100 times worse to meet this justification or burden of proof. So this is a danger, this regressive position that wants to attack the progress and development, essentially the enlightened authority of concepts. And it's not that concepts don't need to be attacked, they do. But see, we're talking about the difference between a nihilistic critique, and there's probably even a better term to a disingenuous regressive critique, a disingenuous regressive tactic to invert, to subvert a position, versus a responsible, enlightened, dialectical critique. Now, I think some people might want to claim that dialectic is not a form of enlightenment, but it absolutely is a form of enlightenment because it's a form of hyper-rationality. And so the dialectical position expands rationality. It doesn't negate it. It doesn't negate identity. It expands our understanding of identity. So it moves us into a more rational position, a more rational understanding, a stronger empirical understanding of the objects we confront in reality, that we engage with in reality. So the important thing is that we don't have a nihilistic critique, that we are beyond this disingenuous, radical, skeptical critique, because we're not actually making progress with that critique. We're regressing with that kind of critique. We're being psychologically deceived by that kind of critique. So what we need to be able to do is have a responsible critique, an enlightened critique, an advanced dialectical critique, where we can see the value in the concept, the pragmatic value even in the concept. And then we try to critique it looking for an actual advance to expand the power and the accuracy of the concept so it actually moves into a better position of freedom, a better expansion of freedom, a better expansion of well-being. That's essentially what we are striving for in the world. And dialectic is suited to engage in that project. And that is a very important project, that is the nature of the critique we have toward the concept.